Good, yeah. Well, first of all, in terms of welcoming you, yes, it's really my pleasure to be here. I also would like to thank Mr. Asanka for his opening words and for his dedication and efforts with TIIKM and all the work that's gone on with that. I was involved in the first World Conference on Scholarly Publishing last year, and I saw that this really did fill a need and a niche for the community that it serves. And so I really respect the values and the goals that the group has. And so I was happy to be invited to be a co-chair for this event and to do what I can to try to continue the efforts for publishing equity in particular. I see the need for that, and as shows here, there's over 70 people on this conference call as well. Part of that is also the fact that the virtual platform really works well for that people can be really anywhere and still join and be part of this. And so I think that's a smart way to do that. In fact, I am coming to you now from Baltimore, Maryland. And so interestingly, now, since these COVID times when we've been doing a lot of virtual platforms, I've given quite a number of early morning talks at 5 and 6 a.m., but this will be, in fact, my latest talk that I've given to date. It's about 11 p.m. here in Baltimore. So we'll see how that goes. Yes, I'd also like to thank Ms. Deshani for her welcome remarks and moderating of the session, and then also Ms. Hashini, who I've been working with closely to contribute as I can to help put the program together and just to coordinate what has been going on with that. So thank you, everybody behind the scenes that is making this work. And then one last point on the welcome is that I see that this is truly a multidisciplinary group that is out there. So as was mentioned in the introduction, my research is in environmental sustainability and using modeling and network analysis. But I would guess that many of you are coming at this from many different fields, and we all have the same goals, which are to have high quality publishing and access to that publishing and access to the content once it is published. So regardless of the disciplines, that we share that common interest. So yeah, and let me just update actually my bio that was read. So yes, I was a longtime editor-in-chief of Ecological Modeling Journal for 12 years, and then I started another journal with Elsevier, which was environmental current research in environmental sustainability, which was mentioned as my current journal. But in fact, as of the end of last year, I have left that, at least the editor-in-chief role of that. I'm still on the board, but I have since then started as a chief editor of Frontiers in Sustainable Resource Management. So that's the one you see there highlighted on the largest one on my cover page. So that is in fact where my efforts are going these days. Interesting to try something with the new publisher after all the years with Elsevier to now work a little more closely with Frontiers. We can talk about that more later in the discussion part. I'd be glad to share some experiences. Okay, so well, one last point before I jump in. It was mentioned that I work at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is a international research organization in Austria, and that I'm involved with the Young Scientist Summer Program. I realize I usually have a slide promoting that and advertising that program, but I don't in the slide deck for whatever reason. But we oftentimes host students from Malaysia or from India or from Indonesia in that summer program. And so if it's something you'd like more information on, please feel free to contact me. The slots for summer 2023, of course, are already filled. Selections have been made. It starts in just a few weeks, but for 2024 and onward, the deadline is always in mid-January for the following summer. So you can keep that in mind also. So my talk is in two parts today then. First about encouraging quality in publishing, which is from my experiences as an editor and the lessons that I've learned. I want to share with you some of those ideas. Hopefully they will be useful for you and helpful as you're preparing your own manuscripts. And then also to say a few things about equity in publishing and how important that is to have, as I said, that the authors from all over the world, but also readers from all over the world to really have access to the publishing community. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and jump in. I know that we have a There was a chat in this, but I believe that you were asked to put in your questions in the Q&A, which is a separate thread, and we can come to that, but we'll also definitely have time at the end. If you want to ask questions, we can have a live conversation on that as well too. So, okay, so here's my advice on writing quality manuscripts, and in particular, as you're preparing to write that. I noticed the first question that in the Q&A already was about, you know, how what's the whole flow of writing a manuscript, and in many ways, that's what I'm going to be covering here. So the first question you have to ask yourself is who's your audience for this publication, and you know, really what are your aims and intents. And most of us as academics are writing to other peers, to writing to other research specialists, but it might be more of a multidisciplinary research community, not as focused and specialized, or it could be policymakers or general audience, right? So how you write and the style that you use is going to have to be flexible depending on who your audience is. When you start to narrow down into the journal that you're wanting to publish in, you know, every journal tends to have its own style. So it really is recommended to get a feel for that style. You know, be sure to read some articles in there. Don't just you know, fly in kind of without being part of that. So so read I mean, it sounds obvious, but read articles in the journal that you want to be publishing in, and then of course checking the scope of the journal, which are usually very clearly laid out. And one of the most strict filters that every journal uses is to make sure that it's in scope. I should add even right now that I think that many journals are looking for reasons not to publish your work, right? There's so much content out there, but they have their own space that they're trying to fill. And of course, they want good research, but if it's out of scope, that's one of the easy ways that they can filter and encourage you to go elsewhere with that. So yeah, obviously make sure you're fitting into the right journal that your research fits into. So yeah, first real piece of advice is consult the guide for authors for any journal that you're looking at publishing. Okay, now I think this is something that's underappreciated by most authors, particularly maybe early career or new authors, is your audience's attention span. Of course, the first thing that anybody who's glancing at the material will look at is the title and the authors, and you know, a few seconds literally to scan it. Do they know the authors? Do they know the institutions? Now, of course, that's where bias already comes in, and that's something that authors in the Global South might have to overcome a little bit. But a good title and you know, and a professional affiliation, you know, should be enough, right, to get you to the next phase, and that's the abstract. And so, you know, people are only going to read the abstract for about a minute, and they're going to scan through it and see, and if they might stop at that point, right? So at each one of these points, they might stop. They might see the title and just say, no further. That's not of interest to me. They read the abstract. Okay, let me go on further. And a lot of people would then just give a very quick skim of the paper, right? Just flip through, look at the figures, look at the main results, maybe the methods, if there's something similar that they're interested in. But again, that's only a few minutes of the reader's time. And then finally, if they really like that, they're going to want to dig into it and see, well, what really are they trying to do here, and how did they do it, and what were their results? And even that is 15 minutes probably. You know, we take, you know, weeks, months to write our papers and make sure that every word is in the right place and well written. But it's very, very rare that your reader's actually going to read your paper from the very first word to the very last word. Because of the time constraints we're all under, we tend to jump in and out of an article looking for the things that are most useful for us. And so so that full read, even a full read, could only be maybe 10 or 15 minutes, right? So kind of keep that in mind. What that means is that you need to grab your audience's attention, again, through good graphics or clear writing or clear statements that really capture what you need to tell the reader. And so what I'm going to do is go through some of those different steps and hopefully give useful advice for how to do that. So first of all, your article should be structured according to some sort of standard format. Now, some journals may vary a little bit on how the structure is, but keeping in mind that each of these different sections has a particular purpose for it, right? Obviously, that introductory material, such as titles, authors, abstract, keywords, highlights, needs to be accurate. That's how people are going to find your papers and be able to access it. Then the main text has this, fairly, I think, structured approach. It's IMROD. So there needs to be a clear introduction, clear methods, results, and then discussion and conclusion. And I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. This is just the overview. And then, of course, some sort of acknowledgements, references, and supplementary material. But this is just the good framework to keep in mind. So let's go through each of these, and I'll give you a little bit of advice on each of these sections, in fact. It might be obvious about authors, you put your name down, but you'd be surprised how sometimes authors will change their names in terms of if you have a short name or abbreviated name. Try to be consistent. So I've tried to make a point that most of my academic papers are Brian D. Fath, but some of them end up Brian Fath, some end up B.D. Fath, some end up just B. Fath, and the thing is that it's all the indexing sites don't recognize that that's me, and that's fairly unique name. There's not too many B. Faths out there, and so be consistent. Use the same name for yourself as you're publishing. Use your full name and so on. And one way really to get around that nowadays is to register and use the ORCID number, which is a global indexing that any author then can use to match a paper with their name. And so, particularly if, I sympathize with some of my international colleagues that have very, very common names. Chen in China or Wang in China. There could be literally hundreds of or thousands of other scholars with those same names, and so as to not get confused in the databases by using the ORCID is one way to do that. Okay, then the abstract. What about a good abstract? I like this: precise and honest. Well, of course, we need to be honest in all of our writing, but really can stand alone. Gives the clear overview of what is going on in that paper and also the results. Knows it uses no technical jargon, no acronyms. There's really no point in using an acronym in a short abstract. Very brief and specific. You also don't want to cite any references. That's not the point, to be jumping ahead into what the paper is about. It's just that very short statement of what you are, what questions you've asked and what you've answered. And I think that the important thing here is that your abstract has to sell your paper to your reader. So the abstract is not a teaser. I think some people think of it as a movie trailer. It's like, hey, my abstract is if you read my paper, you'll find out the great ending that I've come to. No, abstract is not a teaser. It's not a cliffhanger. You give your best results right in the abstract. You tell exactly what you found and why it's important. If they like that, then they will read the paper. If you give them a teaser and make them hunt for it in the rest of the paper, there's a very good chance that they won't believe you that it's a good result, right? So just tell them right up front in the abstract what the great results you've had, have you found is. Yeah, it might seem counterintuitive, but it's really, I think, important to put your best stuff right in the abstract. Keywords, again, it's really important for indexing. It's how people will find your paper. Nobody just sits down and reads journals from front to cover. There aren't even print journals many times anymore. So having good keywords is really important. And my advice here is to whatever set of keywords you've chosen for your paper, to go ahead and just Google those keywords somewhere along the way when you're preparing your paper and before you submit it, because it tells you a couple of things, right? It'll tell you if you put those keywords in and you do a search on Google Scholar and you find all the papers that are the top hits are the papers that you've been referencing, and they're your peer community, and they're the ones that you hope to reach to, then you've done a good job with your keywords. It might be that you find that you've in a different space. Basically, you're getting a lot of different papers that aren't ones you were familiar with or have cited, and it might be that you just missed those papers, right? And so before you publish a paper in that space, go back and read those, cite those, incorporate that knowledge into your research. Or it could be that you're not in the right space because you just had the wrong keywords, right? And so if you end up with all the papers being irrelevant to what your content is, then it could tell you that, oh, I landed in the wrong place, so I need to think about my keywords again. So I mean, it really is a good way to kind of map out where you want to be and with the research that you're doing. Highlights, this is the next step of expediency, I guess, because the abstract is already short enough, but most journals nowadays, actually, it's mandatory to do short 3 to 5 bullet points that convey the core findings of the article. To me, it's almost kind of overkill that if you can't read the abstract, you're going to read these bullet points, but still it's part of what is expected. The advice is the same. Put your best stuff right forward. Don't spend a lot of time on highlights talking about introduction or even methods, unless the methods are really innovative, but just give their boom, boom, boom. Here's exactly what I found and why it's so important, right? So make it the selling point, not a teaser. Okay, then now when we get into the body of the paper, the introduction, of course, you're going to want to put some background information into there about the context of your work. It should be very clear from the introduction why you performed the work, what the aims of the work are and what the significance is. That includes an overview of what has been done before, not an extensive literature review unless it's a review paper, but at least enough of the context, what was done in your paper and what was achieved. And I think that what a good introduction leads the reader to the point where after they've read the introduction, they want to know an answer to a question, and you're going to say, well, this is exactly the question that we're going to ask, right? So it's kind of setting it up so that you've reached the point where you've made it obvious that your research is going to contribute to this field. Yeah, as I said, you don't write an extensive review of the field. A lot of papers that we get, particularly from early career researchers or PhD students, they're always asked in their dissertations to write an extensive review, and that's for their benefit, right? If you're new to a field and you're a PhD student, you're going to need to come up to speed on everything that's going on. But when you're writing your article to your peer community probably knows that already, right? They've been doing this, so they don't need to read a 12-page introduction about all the review. And so that it's always hard leaving a lot of material on the cutting room floor, but that really should be left on the cutting room floor with just the highlights and what's really relevant. Now, if you want to turn it into a review paper, of course, that's a different issue. Good review papers are very important, but they tend to serve a different purpose. It's not just a review, but more of a synthesis and a look forward into the field. So obviously have a broader context. Don't only cite your own work or work of your colleagues or work that supports your findings. You need to have a broad perspective on the literature. It doesn't mean long, but broad, right? And don't also start to get into other things, right? Just the description is the background and leading to that first research question. Anything else should come into its separate section. You don't want to start to confuse sections there. So when you get to the methods, really the main point of the methods is that you should describe the work in detail, sufficient detail, so that somebody else can come in and repeat that work. Now, the reality is they probably wouldn't be able to, because there's parts of it that, you're not going to describe every single, step that you did to do surveys or to code some model or to set up an experiment. But people that are in that field would know how you've done that and feel confident that you did it in a rigorous and a repeatable way. So that's the main point there is that people trust that the information that you've gotten is high quality and rigorous. Just as far as writing goes, typically the methodology would be in past tense, because you're writing about what you've done already, right? So you can get confused maybe a little bit with what tense to write in, but I think past tense is usually the best approach. Results are really straightforward, right? I mean, you're just hammering home again in very clear language what the main findings are, and good graphics are going to be what sells your paper. People are going to flip through first and try to find a good summary of what you've done graphically, and looking at that, and then making sure that the captions that you have for those graphics are standalone, so that somebody could just look at figure 2 and read the caption and know exactly what was going on, not have to refer back to the text. but that's really the main point, right? I mean, there's the results is to get across the findings there. So the discussion now is your chance to interpret what you've done, right? So results can be kind of dry, actually. That's okay, short, crisp, precise, dry. But in the discussion, you now start to dive deeper, how the results relate to that original question that you're trying to ask, put it into the context of the field that you're in, and how this relates to other studies. So your discussion now is where you should bring in the references again. If you're thinking about it, your introduction has the references and your discussion has the references, but really there shouldn't be a lot of references in the results itself, and in the methods, maybe just those few papers that you're relying on, but your discussion definitely should be full of other references and how your paper builds on or reinforces or contradicts what is out there, right? So this is your chance to put your work in the context of those other papers that are already in the field. Give all possible interpretations, right? Research is not absolute or always perfect. So if there's multiple interpretations, don't be afraid to say that in there, but you can come to the conclusion on why you think that the one you're promoting is the most likely. But just hiding other information is not going to usually fly well with reviewers either. So, and in the discussion, you can start to talk about limitations of your study, things that you're aware of for whatever reason that are constraining your work, but then also that's your chance to suggest future work. Every paper can't solve all the problems, but you can say, oh, based on this, we now know we need to be looking at these other things. So I think that's all the fair game for the discussion. So then a conclusion, some journals don't even really ask for this. I think having a 1 or 2 paragraph conclusion is completely reasonable, because again, that reader that's skimming the paper can jump to the conclusion. And if they looked at just the abstract and the conclusion, they get a good sense of what the paper was about. So it's a short summary of the main findings. And again, how this is an important advance in the field. You don't need to write a long conclusion that repeats everything and how you did it and what you found out. That is elsewhere in the paper. Don't be overly speculative and grandiose and braggadocio and so on. Don't overemphasize the impact of your study. So modesty is okay too. Good results will carry themselves. You don't need to oversell if it really is a good paper. Acknowledgements. Now you're getting into the back material. Anyone who's helped with your study, of course, should be mentioned in the acknowledgements. State why people have been acknowledgements. Ask their permission. If you're going to put their name in a paper, is always a good idea. Any funding sources that you might have, including grant and reference numbers. Many journals now are asking for you to put in author contributions. So they even have a list of different categories: conceptualizing the paper, writing the first draft, writing future drafts, revising, editing, and so on. So there's data collection, data analysis, and you can put specifically, and that's okay. I mean, if one author only provided data, but that was a key part of that paper, that's sufficient for them to be a co-author, then you can just say that they provided the data that was key for this study. So that can be part of the acknowledgements, and they can be co-author as well. And conflicts, list any potential conflicts of interest that might arise. That's pretty clear. A few things about the references. Obviously, every journal is going to have their own format, so make sure you have the correct format. One of the advantages of a lot of the kind of online publishing that we have now is that the journal can fairly quickly alter whatever format you send them into the format of their own journal. So they're maybe even a little bit less strict than that than they were before. But obviously you want to check and make sure everything's accurate and correctly spelled. The number of authors you need to include before using et al. Things like that are key to having good references. It might not always be avoidable, but it's not good to use unpublished observations or submitted manuscripts or personal communications in your references. Unfortunately, we'll come to this later, I think, but publishing is an English language activity, and so if you're citing a lot of papers that are in other languages, that can make it more difficult as well too. And of course, avoid excessive self-citation and even journal self-citation. I know a lot of journals are pushing for you to have a minimum number of citations from their own journal because they're literally trying to manipulate impact factor, which is not really an ethical thing to do, but they but you know, the right number of journal self citations is right, but not just stacking for the sake of doing it. The point about the unpublished observations and submitting manuscripts is that you know, if you have a key part of your research that is a second paper, maybe like a preliminary paper that you've written and it's in submission, it's under review, and then you're building on that and you submit the next paper already. It happens all the time. It happens with my own research as well too, where the reviewers, you know, if they're good, attentive reviewers, they'll come back and they'll say, well, that other paper hasn't been accepted yet. You know, how can you build on a platform that hasn't been built yet? And so they literally will put a hold on that paper until that first paper passes the peer review and gets published. And then they say, okay, I might not have personally reviewed that paper, but I can accept now that it has been published elsewhere, and take for, you know, the validity of that work. So it is the case that if you're citing a lot of unpublished stuff, that it might hold up the paper that you're currently working on. Supplemental material. The other really advantage we have of online publishing is that page counts really don't matter. It's costless for the journal to just link to another space where you can include all your data, your model codes, you know, maybe mathematical proofs. It's something you do, survey results, spreadsheets, so on. So all of this would then be available online as a separate link to your paper. And I think that this movement towards open model or open publishing is really promoting the idea that you really give your material fully to your reader. And so, you know, of course, there may be some reasons why you're still analyzing it. You hope to get more papers out of it. You don't want everyone to see all your data, but still the access that we're trying to give to the community in order to further the research is moving towards more open publishing. Okay, some final checks then after you've gone through all of that. You know, try to, you know, things that might be able to prevent early rejection and how you can make sure it's in the best state. You know, ask colleagues to take a look at it and be critical. You know, find a colleague that you can trust that will actually take the time. Maybe not to copy edit it, maybe they're too busy for that, but to really, you know, really look through it and give you that honest, critical response, not to just, yeah, it looks good, great, submit it, but try to do what they can to give you feedback and to make it better, right? That's the whole point there. I mean, the very first paper I published is I was a grad student. I gave it to another older but fellow grad student, and he came back and his response was, I would reject this paper. And of course, I was kind of shocked by his bluntness and by his almost aggression on that. But, you know, he walked me through it and showed me places where the paper could be better. And I made those changes before the submission. And I think that did help. And it was eventually published. So that's good news. Again, check that everything meets the requirements set out in the guide for authors. Check the scope is appropriate one more time, maybe from when you started it and targeted a certain journal, that the paper ended up going in a slightly different direction or maybe a largely different direction. You know, change journals at this point rather than submitting inappropriately. And balanced literature is important. So those are some of the final checks. Now, your cover letter that you're including with your paper, I consider the cover, as an editor, I consider the cover letter more of a contract than anything. I don't like long cover letters. If you write a 2-page, 3-page cover letter, you're wasting your time because your paper is already there. So I'm not going to read a 2 or 3-page cover letter. But it does need to have the editor's name. You know, I think it's important to take the time to put the editor in the journal's name on the cover letter. You know, the funny thing there is it's quite common where I get a article to the journal, and what happened, it seems obvious, was that they had submitted to another journal. It was rejected at that journal, and they were impatient, and they just immediately wanted to resubmit to another journal. And so the cover letter to me is actually the name of the other journal and the editor of the other journal, and so they you know, not attentive to a small detail that they're now at a different journal. So if you have it be specific, at least it gives that first clue that you're serious, that you've taken the time to acknowledge that journal and that editor. And then, you only need a couple sentences. You don't need several pages. You need a couple sentences. First one, providing the title on the author list, confirm that all authors are agreeing to it. And then 1 or 2 sentences describing the main findings and significance, if you think that it's important to sell it there. But again, we have your paper, so the editors are not going to need to read a long cover letter. You confirm the originality, and you confirm that you're not submitting it elsewhere. So that's by originality. So that's why I said it's more of a contract, that cover letter is the place where, by you signing that cover letter, you're putting your academic integrity in that letter by saying, I'm not submitting it elsewhere. And we know that authors are trying to get stuff published as fast as possible, but you cannot take your same paper and submit it to 4 different journals at the same time, because that's not how this works. It's not a race to who's going to publish you first. It's really, unfortunately, maybe, but it needs to be working in series, not in parallel. And so when you write in that cover letter that it's not being considered elsewhere, then and if we find out that it was, then there can be repercussions, maybe banned from the journal or other things that, or we talk to the other editors, and maybe all journals end up rejecting your paper because the kind of dishonest approach that was taken. So and then the last point, yes, so almost every journal now is going to have you suggest potential reviewers. This is really important because finding reviewers for your paper is the most challenging thing that any editor has. I've gone from, when I was first involved with ecological modeling in the mid 2000s, you invite 2 or 3 or 4 reviewers, you get 2 reviews, right? And nowadays we're inviting 15, 20, 30, 40 reviewers to get 2 reviews, because there's proliferation of papers, but also just the time crunch that everyone has, that people aren't reviewing maybe, or they just can't keep up. It's not that people are reviewing less necessarily, but just the increase. So by you suggesting a potential reviewer, if even one of those is a hit, you're halfway there to getting your paper reviewed. But you can't include people that you're too close to, right? So the editor is going to see, oh, you've published with that person, or you're at the same institution, or whatever affiliation you might have with that person. So you basically would be wasting one of those potential suggestions, because the editor is not going to choose one of those. But also, be strategic, right? If you're writing in a particular field and there's 2 or 3 top names in that field, the odds are those people aren't going to review your paper. I mean, the reality is also that they're swamped and they're too busy. And so by putting just those other top names down as your potential reviewers, it might seem obvious, you might want them to read your paper, but unlikely that that's going to be successful. So you want to find people in the field, obviously, but maybe people that they've worked with, or people that are maybe even a little more early career. But yeah, be strategic, right? Really try to think who would agree to review my paper and be able to give me not positive comments in the sense of accepting it, but useful and constructive comments. So I'll say more about reviewing actually in just a second. So here's the first stage, right? Your paper was not rejected, right? So that's the first thing. So that first filter, as I mentioned, is the editor is really the first chance to reject your paper out of scope, maybe just really obviously bad language or some other things that jump out. But if that's not the case, and they send it out for review, and you get these 2 reviews back, or 3 reviews, or whatever it might be, that was progress, right? You made it to the review stage. And it might be that after those reviews come back, that they say, sorry, your paper's not acceptable for publication. Say something more about that in a minute, but let's say that it wasn't. Let's say major revision, moderate revision, minor revision, something like that. And I will add that I think in the almost 15, 20 years I've been an editor, I think I've had 2 papers that, like, consensus among reviewers that accept as is. I mean, that's unheard of. In fact, we're always looking for something to try to make it better, but there are occasionally those times when somebody submits a paper, probably was not a first draft. It had probably gone through a couple other journals and was revised anyways, or maybe the person just really nailed it. But there's always going to be some revision involved, I guess is the point. So when you submit that paper, and if it goes out for review, if it doesn't go out for review, you're probably going to hear back within a few days that it's not in scope or it's rejected, right? So that gives you an immediate feedback to do something else. But while it's out there for review, you just have to be patient. You have to wait. And I like to tell authors that reach out to me, 3 months is really not uncommon. And so, I know that there's pressures to ramp up these times. I know MDPI is a sponsor of this conference. I published at MDPI. I'm an editor on some of their journals as well too. And they're doing amazing things with reducing that time, but there are limits to that. And so, don't start bugging editors. I say until 3 months have passed. I think after 3 months, then sure, reach out directly to an editor and say, hey, what's up with my paper? Sometimes that can help shake loose a paper that for whatever reason is stuck. Typically they get stuck because a reviewer has agreed to review the paper, but then is late and doesn't, if the reviewers keep rejecting to review it, that triggers the system to keep alerting the editor to to keep looking. But if a reviewer agrees but then doesn't submit, that tends to be where things get stuck, and then the editor can come in and again shake that reviewer or find another reviewer, whatever is needed. But point is that there's a time lag. We just can't help that. I mean, it's we want to have papers out as soon as possible, but sometimes these things take months. So when that first decision is made, then now the ball is back in your court, right? So you have the paper back again, and however long you take to do that revision, that time is on your clock. So you want to prioritize getting that done, because you can't control the reviewers, but you can control yourself. There may be times when there's other things, it's heavy teaching load in your semester or something else is going on. I've had times, even just like this January, I had like 3 or 4 papers all come back at the exact same time with major revision, and you have to just prioritize. And one I'm still very slow to get to, which is frustrating, but all the other needs are there. Point is that you want to shrink that time, because that's the one thing you control. You send it back again, it might go out for review again. I'm going to say something more about that, but again, that's out of your hands. But it might be several more months while it's out for review another time. Then finally another decision, and then probably one last minor revision, and then you're good to be published. So when you're making those responses, this is where you can control this. So even though I'm referring now to this, particularly the second time the paper is out for review, that you can influence that by having a very good letter to the editor. And so by good letter, I mean that you have a detailed response for every point that the reviewers have made, and the editors if they're making specific points. So so even if you disagree with something, have that bullet point in there and mention why you disagree and what your arguments are. Always be polite, always be generous. It's costless for you, and it's the right thing to do. I mean, these reviewers have given their time, typically also from their perspective, without any kind of pay. They're donating their time as professional service. And so there's no point on attacking a reviewer or being dismissive of a reviewer. And so manuscripts should always have line numbers, page numbers, and so you can respond very specifically to where in the article you've made those changes and how you've addressed that. If it means that the reviewers need to see extra work, do the extra work. Don't just hand wave it away and try to make a revision that is superficial. I mean, sometimes the paper just needs more work, and it's only going to make the paper stronger, even if that does mean investing more time on your end, and maybe even more maybe you thought that you were saving that next step for your next paper. Well, you might need it in this paper. What the reviewers are telling you is that there was not enough standalone new knowledge in this paper, that you need to do a little bit more. And so, you do it, I guess. And then when you're writing that letter to the editor, make it very clear the response that you have. So, whether you use something like this, where you do column format, and you have every point from every review comment, and then your response to it, and so on, all the way through, or maybe just different colors, review comment response, review comment response, or different fonts, whatever you want to do, italics and so on. And if I could see that as an editor, I could very quickly see what was done. And the key that you want here is to not have to have it go back for review again. right? So if the editor can see what was done, they oftentimes, I would prefer actually not to bother my reviewers again. I would prefer to say, oh, the authors did a really good job here. It looks like they've addressed every single point. I agree with that. I'm going to, you know, maybe just see a few minor things I want changed, or maybe even accept it as is. But you see the importance of that. If we can't tell what's going on, we have to send it back to the reviewer, because we don't have time to dig into that, and the reviewer is more familiar with it. The reviewer hopefully will dig into that. One of those papers I mentioned in January of my own that came back with major revision, my co-authors, particularly a postdoc who's working with me, 35-page response to reviewers. I mean, there were a lot of review comments, 3 reviewers, but she compiled very detailed response, 35 pages of, here was the comment, here was the response, and it was you know, very well done. So I think it helped us, right? In fact, we just today got the word that paper was accepted. So yeah, you can greatly reduce the review time through well-structured response. If your paper is rejected, don't take it personally, right? So it's not it's not the academic community's out to get you, but there must be something. Try to understand what it was that the reviewers were getting at. Sometimes reviewers are wrong. I mean, they're not, they might not understand what you were doing, but that is a sign to you that the reviewer wasn't stupid, but you didn't communicate to the reviewer, right? The reviewer is your peer community. And if the reviewer didn't understand it, you need to think about, well, how can I communicate this material? Because the material is correct, but I just didn't do a good job of communicating it, right? So really try to understand, you know, if there's something wrong with the paper or wrong with the communication of the paper. Those are 2 different things, but both need to be addressed, or could need to be addressed. Yeah, what was wrong with it? Do you still need more data and more research, or was it just the wrong journal? That's oftentimes the case. But as I said, don't get that rejection letter and then within 24 hours, or even within 2 hours, just turn that paper around and into another journal. I mean, the odds are it's going to be rejected there too, because, you know, you haven't taken the time to reflect on the information you've got, the reviews that you've got. You know, even a rejected paper, you're going to have some review comments that should be helpful for you to make your paper better. So you still have to revise the paper that was rejected. You don't only revise papers that call for revision, right? That should make sense. So, okay, yeah. So in summary, the whole point is finding the right journal, and there are many journals out there. So you should be able to do that. Follow the guide, be clear, concise, correct, and honest in the paper. Seek feedback from colleagues. And, you know, each paper is really a learning and teaching opportunity. You're trying to teach your peers, your community, your readers about what you're doing, but you're learning something in that process, right? So the learning doesn't happen just in the lab, or you know, in the field, in the models, but it's actually in the writing too. So you should, you know, I have colleagues that don't like to write, and that's unfortunate, because writing is one of the pillars of academia, and so it has to be part of the learning and kind of just the whole process of what we do, and hopefully we're having fun doing it. I mean, I know that may be a little trite there at the end, but as I said, it's one of the things we do. So hopefully we get some joy and some learning experience from that. Yeah, and then eventually we get that nice letter that says your paper's been accepted, congratulations. So that's the time then to celebrate for a minute and reflect back on that. So that's the first part of this presentation, which is really the longer part of the presentation. I see I'm now at 44 minutes already. And so, but actually, since that took a little longer than I thought, well, I think I'm just going to go through the next couple of slides that I have on equity issues, but then we can come back and take questions on anything I touched upon in the publishing part, and then also on the second part. So my view of equity in publishing, and I really think that the things that are going on with the so, you know, the sponsor of this journal with TIIKM and some of the other efforts are really important in promoting equity in publishing. It's clearly, there is a divide, as what was pointed out in the introduction, between North and South, and both access to publishing, but also access to content. And I sense that there is a global commitment to break that divide and to really do what we can. So anyways, the equity issue always has to be taken in mind of the two different sides. So there's authors and readers. So on one hand, so a lot of this comes down to now like this pay to publish approach. And from an author's perspective, that can be very exclusive, because you might not have the money to pay for as an author to publish your work. But once that happens in an open access journal, you now have complete equity for the reader, right? The open access journals, by definition, is you don't have to be at a university. Even you can, anybody can go to the website, download all the content. And that's really the model that these open access journals have. So the equity then becomes on the side of the reader, but maybe it's less equitable on the author's side, right? We like journals that we can submit our papers to and not have to pay. We already think it's enough of a sacrifice that we're basically giving away our content, signing over copyrights for content for free. But now that be asked to pay seems like that's going to have a multi-tiered system of those that can pay and those that can't. But where's the equity? What are we trying to do? Equity in authors or readers? What we want is both, of course. And so that's what gets us in these two different models, subscription versus open access. And traditionally, all the publishing was done by subscription journals, which meant that the authors, as I said, give their content away for free, but they're not asked then to pay anything. But then the journal, the publishing company, gets their funds from selling subscriptions to your journal. And so, this was typically libraries, but then it typically became libraries at large research universities or large research institutes, maybe some consortiums, but the large majority of people were closed out of being able to have access to those papers. And so, and the other thing was that there was a kind of a dependency on the subscriptions, that the publishers could more or less control prices, because once there was this dependency, that the universities had to pay for it. Right. I know I'm sure you've heard stories of, Elsevier being in a negotiation with different university systems and consortiums, and the kind of tensions that created there, with prices going up and the university really having no choice. I know my own library, Itachi University, has had to cut back and say, which of these journals do you not want, or can we survive without having, because our library budget just can't afford to keep going up and up every year. And I know other libraries struggle with that as well too. And if they bundle all the journals together, then you might even be getting titles that you're not really interested in, but it's kind of like cable television, right? They bundle things and then charge more for it. But anyways, the point is that subscription model has its own flaws. The author likes it because they don't have to pay, but then the university or the research community ends up paying through these subscriptions. Open access is just the opposite. As I just mentioned, the author pays up front, which has its issues for sure that need to be overcome, but then the reader has complete access to it. So I've just said all of this already, but putting content behind firewalls and the subscription model is not an equitable way of publishing. Open access is much more equitable for the readers, but then the flip side is that it's the costs are borne by the authors, and authors oftentimes don't have these funds. What's interesting, and I'll show this in the next slide, I guess, is that the cost per unit of publishing is actually cheaper typically in open access journals than in subscription journals. It's just that the different entity is paying for that. So it seems more expensive because we're being asked to pay $800 or $2,000 or $3,000 to publish an article, but that same article that went into a subscription journal might actually be costing $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 per unit, but the price is borne by somebody else, right? So this was actually some data that was collected. There you see over there on the side, a collection of different journal articles, or of publishers, excuse me, and subscription articles range anywhere from about $4,000 per article to even close to $10,000 per article. And so obviously if it's a niche journal and they're not publishing very much and they're still collecting a lot of subscriptions, that's where that cost could go quite high. So the other thing that's moving this whole field, and I think you're all aware of this probably, is that many governments are moving towards open access because this readability issue, and particularly with the federally funded research by whatever federal government that is. In fact, this started with the UK, I believe, about 10 years ago. The UK passed a law that basically said if you are doing research, if you're publishing research based on federally funded grants, then everybody in the country has the right, even not just the right, the right and expectation to be able to read those results, which means you have to publish in an open access journal so that any British citizen can go and find that, right? You don't have to belong to a university or to some consortium. And so that kind of moved the field. Since then, many other European countries have passed similar things, and I'd heard that the United States also just last fall, President Biden signed into effect some very similar, that all federally funded research by 2025 or 26 or something has to be published in open access. So the response of the journals to that was to make these hybrid journals. So many of the subscription journals now have this two-tiered thing, which I think is clearly not a sustainable approach, because they still are charging subscription costs for the people that want to publish traditionally, but then authors in those same titles are now being given the option of paying, oftentimes quite a bit, a couple thousands of dollars, to have their article open access in a closed journal, essentially, right? That's this hybrid model. This started with only maybe 5-10% of the authors having the ability or desire to do that. Now, some of these journals, it could be the majority of papers that are that, and there can be some double dipping going on, right? So that the publisher is collecting from the authors, but they're probably not reducing subscription rates from their university contracts either. So interestingly, though, it has driven down the cost. The open access option seems to be driving down the costs overall of publishing, because it's opened up some competition in these fields. Publishers like MDPI, which are fairly new, and Frontiers, which are fairly new, and are entirely open access, entirely driven by author processing charges, is a new model, right? And they're trying to shift costs, but lower costs, but they've shifted it now to the author. What I think is probably going to happen is that there will be more consortiums where the authors don't pay, but again, the libraries for those universities pay, just as they were paying subscriptions before. But that's this transition that we're on. So how do I think this is going to go forward? I think it's unstable right now. I think that the way publishing is done is not sustainable. It's going to find a new normal that is not this weird mishmash of only subscription and hybrid and open access. And I mean, maybe diversity has its advantages, but right now I think it's actually self-defeating, and none of them are really the right model yet. But I think open access will be the way of the future. I think that's what these national agreements are driving the field that way, and therefore open access means that what we need to solve is this price model that works for the authors. And if you're going to publish multiple papers, I know grants nowadays are very much accepting you to include publishing costs into a grant, but that's still, it's not like all the grant money just went up in order to deal with that. So that has its limitations. But I like this model where there's additional consortiums. Like I said, like maybe the country even has an agreement with the publisher that anybody with an affiliation that publishes from Germany that is publishing an MDPI now has a waiver, because Germany has paid up front whatever is a agreeable priced MDPI, and so on, right? So that seems to be the substitution of what was formerly a library subscription, but now with a upfront subscription to these open access journals. Now, the other point about equity that is going to be really important, and this is already part of the field, is that almost all of those pay to publish publishers have varying costs depending on where you're coming from. So they also clearly recognize that somebody from Switzerland or Germany isn't going to have the same price point as somebody that's coming from Sri Lanka or Indonesia, and it's just the reality of that global south, global north access to resources, and those publishers do have scholarships, they do have waivers, they do have ways of varying the costs depending on what country you're coming from. I was looking into my own Frontiers journal just now about this. They are very proud of the fact that they offered millions of dollars of waivers last year across their journal portfolio. They're still working out the best ways, I think, to implement that. Right now, you actually have to go through the process. You don't really know upfront, which I think is unfortunate, what exactly the final is going to be, but you start to submit the journal article and work your way through that, and then at the end they give you well, this is what you'd have to pay if it were accepted. And so it's not just a price list you can easily jump to and coordinate your institution versus what they're going to charge, but they're I think they're getting there. But they would definitely work with you and not have you pay the full price depending on your institution. So my bottom point is that more needs to be done on this front, but that's because it's a new approach, right? We have not found the optimal workable solution yet, but we're working towards that. So I'll throw this in there as well too, because one of the so first of all, when we went from paper to online, we did lose some like archival aspects of the journals, right? I mean, I love the fact that I can go into my library and I can pull off science or nature or world proceedings of something like that and find a hard copy paper from 100 years ago and read those articles, right? It's there, it's in print, it's solid. If it's not in my library, it's in the other libraries across the institutional landscape. If it's an online journal only, if that online journal goes out of business, that publisher, who's going to pay to keep the servers running? Who's going to pay to keep that content available? And so there's I think has to be a lot of thought into the knowledge storage of everything that's being generated, and particularly for these online only articles. And so I do think that there was the subscription model had a kind of a built-in advantage. I mean, obviously paper had that built-in advantage, but I know that the subscription journals, again, I can refer to my experience with Elsevier, that they took that task very seriously, and they invested a lot of money in archiving and backing up their systems and their content, and working with libraries to make sure that if something happens, if there's a power outage at the Elsevier headquarters, that they don't just lose all the content that they've worked so hard to publish and so on. So it's might seem like it's not relevant right now, but I think as a discipline, we need to recognize that the work we're doing now should have legs, right? It should have impact into the future, just as the previous generations have had. So I'm a little worried about that, right? That this kind of only online model, and maybe some of these other things won't be as serious about that. So bottom line here is that publishing is changing, right? And so it's not going to be the same as when I started in this field 20 years ago, and I think it's very dynamic right now, and we should influence where it goes as much as possible as authors, as editors, to shape that landscape, and not be completely at pawns at how either national legislation or publishers or whoever else out there is influencing things. So anyways, that's the content that I had on this second part. Be glad to talk about any of these things in more detail, get feedback from you on open access publishing, your thoughts on it, your concerns, your challenges with it, also feedback on publishing fees we can talk about. And then if you want to also, as I mentioned, the key part about really publishing is reviewing, and hopefully all of you in your discipline are also reviewing, but we could talk a little bit more